In the grand tapestry of galactic civilization, certain truths remain as constant as the speed of light and twice as inconvenient. Chief among these is the simple fact that every inhabited sector of space maintains a delicate balance of terror, carefully orchestrated by whatever nightmare evolution decided to gift with teeth, claws, and an appetite for anything foolish enough to breathe within a 3-parsec radius. The Kepler 442b system had won this particular lottery with all the enthusiasm of a condemned prisoner receiving their execution date. Its sole terrestrial world hosted the Void Stalker, a creature whose very existence had prompted the Galactic Navigation Authority to classify the entire system as a mandatory detour zone, bureaucratic speak for "approach this place and your next of kin will receive a very apologetic form letter." For 73 standard years, the creature had maintained its reputation through the simple expedient of being absolutely, horrifically effective at its chosen profession of ending lives. Trade routes bent around Kepler 442b like light around a black hole, creating shipping delays that cost the galactic economy approximately 4 billion credits annually. Insurance companies had created an entirely new risk category just to avoid paying claims related to the system. 3 separate xenobiology expeditions had vanished without so much as a distress beacon, leaving behind only the kind of silence that makes statisticians weep and accountants reach for stronger stimulants. The beast itself defied easy categorization, which was unfortunate given the galactic scientific community's obsession with filing everything under neatly labeled taxonomic categories. Preliminary scans from the safety of several light-years away suggested something roughly the size of a small starship, possessed of adaptive camouflage that rendered most sensors useless, and equipped with enough natural weaponry to make a battlecruiser envious. Its hunting grounds encompassed the entire planet's surface, and its patience was legendary among the few survivors who had glimpsed it from extreme distance before executing the fastest hyperspace jumps in recorded history. The creature's methodology was elegantly simple. Detect intrusion, stalk prey with supernatural patience, then unleash violence so swift and comprehensive that most victims never realized they had transitioned from alive to statistical footnote. It was, by every measure that mattered to sensible beings throughout the galaxy, the perfect apex predator, which made the current situation somewhat awkward. A small research vessel that had just impacted the planet's northern continent, with all the grace of a drunken asteroid, had clearly not received the memo about mandatory detours. Its emergency beacon shrieked across multiple frequencies, a digital death cry that every sentient being within 50 parsecs would recognize as the prelude to another tragic accident in the Kepler system's growing collection of mysterious disappearances. From the twisted wreckage of what had once been a respectable scientific survey craft, a figure emerged with the sort of calm efficiency that suggested either supreme confidence or complete ignorance of local hazards. The being appeared humanoid, roughly average height by galactic standards, with the pale complexion and slightly soft physique that marked her as originating from one of those comfortable core worlds where the greatest daily threat was typically over-caffeinated beverages. She surveyed the crash site with the detached interest of someone assessing a minor inconvenience rather than a potentially fatal disaster. Her equipment pack, somehow still intact despite the violent landing, contained the standard assortment of scientific instruments, emergency rations, and survival gear that marked her as either a researcher or someone with remarkably poor vacation planning skills. The planet's atmosphere registered as breathable, if somewhat thin, while the local temperature hovered at the edge of comfortable. Twin suns cast harsh shadows across a landscape that might have been beautiful, if not for the pervasive sense that everything visible was somehow waiting for an opportunity to commit murder. Crystalline formations jutted from the ground like frozen screams, while the distant mountains wore crowns of clouds that seemed to move with predatory intent. Her ship's computer, operating on backup power and what appeared to be spite, managed one final helpful contribution before expiring completely. Warning signals cascaded across the cracked display screen, each alert more dire than the last. Apex predator detected, immediate evacuation recommended. Survival probability negligible. Next of kin notification. Prepared for transmission. The human read these warnings with the expression of someone reviewing a grocery list, made a notation in her personal data pad, and began the methodical process of salvaging useful equipment from the wreckage. Her movements were economical, purposeful, and entirely devoid of the sort of panic that most intelligent species would consider appropriate under the circumstances. Somewhere in the crystalline formations that dominated the northern sector, something vast and patient stirred. Ancient senses, honed by decades of successful predation, detected the electromagnetic signature of a crashed vessel and the distinctive biorhythms of a stranded survivor. The hunt, as it had 73 times before, was about to begin. The Voidstalker had never failed to claim its prey. Today it anticipated, would maintain that perfect record with all the certainty of physics and considerably more violence. After all, what possible threat could one small, soft creature pose to the undisputed master of an entire world? It was, the creature would soon discover, asking precisely the wrong question. The Voidstalker moved through its domain with the fluid confidence of a creature that had never encountered a problem it couldn't solve through the liberal application of extreme violence. Its form shifted between states of matter with casual disregard for the laws of physics that lesser beings found so constraining, now solid as diamond-hard chitin, now flowing like liquid shadow between the crystalline spires that dotted its hunting ground. For 7 decades, this approach had yielded consistent results. The methodology was simple. Detect intrusion, assess threat level, invariably minimal, eliminate target with overwhelming force, return to peaceful slumber until the next foolish visitor arrived. It was a system that worked with the reliability of orbital mechanics and considerably more satisfaction. The current prey presented all the usual characteristics that marked it for swift termination. Single organism, isolated from any support, equipped with primitive technology that might as well have been stone knives for all the protection it offered. The bioelectric signature suggested a standard carbon-based life form, with the usual complement of organs that could be catastrophically rearranged with minimal effort. And yet, as the creature began its standard stalking approach, something felt distinctly off about this particular hunt. The target had established what appeared to be a temporary shelter using debris from the crashed vessel, which was standard behavior for stranded beings hoping to survive long enough for rescue. What was decidedly non-standard was the methodical way she went about it, selecting materials not for their protective value but for their structural integrity, as if she were planning to maintain the shelter for weeks, rather than hoping to survive the next few hours. More perplexing still was her apparent indifference to the obvious signs of predation that littered the immediate area. The crystalline formations bore deep scoring marks where previous prey had attempted to find shelter, only to discover that the Voidstalker's claws could carve through solid rock-like atmosphere. Scattered debris from earlier victims lay partially embedded in the ground, testament to the violence of their final moments. Any sensible being would have recognized these markers and responded with appropriate terror. The human walked past them while taking measurements. The creature adjusted its approach, moving closer through dimensions that most species couldn't perceive, let alone defend against. Its hunting instincts, refined through countless successful kills, suggested that perhaps this prey simply lacked the intelligence to recognize danger. Some species were remarkably dense about such things, blundering through hazardous environments with the oblivious confidence of the terminally naive. But as it observed her work, this theory began to crumble like poorly constructed hypotheses often do when confronted with inconvenient facts. The human's shelter wasn't just functional, it was ingeniously designed to channel wind patterns for optimal heating and cooling, positioned to take advantage of the twin suns' path across the sky, and reinforced at precisely the stress points that would matter if something large and violent decided to test its structural integrity. She hadn't stumbled onto these solutions through luck. She had calculated them with the sort of precision that marked genuine expertise. Her equipment revealed similar competence. What had initially appeared to be standard scientific instruments were, upon closer examination, multi-purpose tools adapted for hostile environments. Her scanning device doubled as a defensive perimeter detector. Her sample containers were hardened against atmospheric corrosives that would dissolve most metals. Her food rations were concentrated to the point where she could survive for months on what appeared to be a week's supply. This was not the loadout of someone who had accidentally wandered into danger. This was the equipment manifest of someone who regularly made a living in places where mistakes carried permanent consequences. The Voidstalker paused in its approach, experiencing something it had not felt in decades. Uncertainty. Not fear, precisely. The concept remained alien to a creature that had never encountered anything capable of threatening it, but a growing sense that its initial assessment might require revision. The prey continued her work with maddening composure, occasionally glancing in the creature's direction with the casual interest of someone noting weather patterns, rather than scanning for mortal threats. Once, she even appeared to look directly at its concealed position, her gaze lingering for several seconds before returning to her tasks with a slight shrug. It was impossible, of course. The Void Stalker's camouflage had never been penetrated by anything short of military-grade sensors, and certainly not by the unaugmented visual systems of a standard biological entity, yet something in that brief moment of eye contact suggested she was aware of being observed, and more disturbingly, entirely unconcerned by the fact. The creature began to circle wider, testing different approaches while maintaining its patient surveillance. Perhaps the prey was simply delaying the inevitable through some form of psychological denial, refusing to acknowledge the hopelessness of her situation until the final moment when reality could no longer be ignored. It had observed similar behavior in other species, the desperate pretense of normalcy in the face of certain doom. But as the local day cycle progressed, this explanation also proved inadequate. The human's activities followed a logical progression: shelter, perimeter assessment, resource inventory, communication attempts, and finally the systematic exploration of the immediate area. Each phase was executed with calm professionalism, as if she were following a well-rehearsed protocol, rather than improvising responses to a survival crisis. Most telling of all was her reaction to finding the remains of the Voidstalker's previous victims. Where other beings had responded to such discoveries with panic or despair, she merely catalogued the evidence with scientific detachment, making notes about decomposition rates and local scavenger activity. She examined claw marks in the stone with the interest of someone studying geological formations, apparently oblivious to their implications for her own longevity. By the time the first sun began its descent toward the horizon, the creature had completed 2 full circuits of the crash site and reached a conclusion that challenged everything it understood about the natural order of predator and prey relationships. This particular prey was not behaving like prey at all. The realization was profoundly disturbing, not because it suggested immediate danger — the human remained obviously outmatched in any direct confrontation — but because it implied the existence of concepts the Voidstalker had never needed to consider. Concepts like strategy, preparation, and the possibility that some beings might view a hostile environment not as an insurmountable threat, but as simply another problem requiring an appropriate solution. As the creature settled into position for the final phase of its hunt, preparing to close the distance and end this increasingly puzzling encounter, one last detail caught its attention. The human had positioned her shelter with clear sight lines in all directions, yes, but she had also arranged her equipment in a specific pattern that looked almost like the Voidstalker's ancient mind, evolved for killing rather than complex analysis, struggled with the concept for several moments before arriving at the uncomfortable truth. It looked like a trap. The Voidstalker possessed sensory capabilities that bordered on the supernatural, an evolutionary gift package that included the ability to analyze atmospheric particles at the molecular level. It was this particular talent that had made it such an effective hunter, the capacity to taste fear in the air, to detect the chemical signatures of panic and desperation that marked doomed prey in their final hours, which was why the complete absence of such markers from the crash site was so profoundly unsettling. Instead of the expected cocktail of stress hormones and terror-induced pheromones, the air carried something else entirely. The human scent profile suggested calm focus, the sort of controlled alertness that marked a professional at work rather than a victim awaiting execution. More disturbing still were the trace chemical signatures that spoke of recent physical conditioning, advanced nutrition supplements, and what the creature's ancient instincts recognized with growing alarm as combat stimulants. Not the crude adrenaline surge of fight-or-flight responses, but the carefully regulated biochemistry of someone whose body had been systematically prepared for violence. The revelation prompted a deeper analysis, one that required the Voidstalker to extend its perception beyond the immediate vicinity. Its awareness expanded, reading the microscopic story written in skin cells and exhaled breath, in the oils transferred from fingertips to equipment, in the subtle electromagnetic patterns that surrounded all living beings like invisible signatures. The data painted a picture that challenged every assumption the creature had made about its intended prey. The human cellular structure bore the telltale modifications of gravity adaptation therapy, suggesting she had spent significant time in variable gain environments. Her bone density registered at nearly twice standard baseline for her apparent species type, while her muscle fibers showed the enhanced efficiency patterns that came from extended exposure to high-stress situations. Most telling of all, her neural activity exhibited the distinctive brainwave signatures of someone who had been surgically implanted with combat enhancement wetware. This was not a lost researcher, this was a soldier. The Void Stalker's worldview, previously as stable as planetary orbit, began to experience what lesser beings might recognize as an existential crisis. For 7 decades it had operated under the comfortable assumption that it represented the apex of lethality within its domain. This belief had been supported by consistent empirical evidence. Everything that entered its territory died, usually within hours of arrival, but the expanding analysis of the human's biological markers suggested a deeply uncomfortable possibility that perhaps the Void Stalker had been operating at the top of a much smaller food chain than it had realized. The creature's enhanced olfactory systems detected trace elements that spoke of exposure to exotic radiation signatures, the kind produced by weapons that existed solely for the purpose of ending lives on an industrial scale. Chemical residues in her clothing fibers told stories of atmospheric compositions found only on worlds where the very air was toxic to most life forms. Her equipment bore microscopic scarring consistent with encounters involving energy weapons, explosive decompression, and the sort of kinetic impacts that occurred when large objects collided at relativistic speeds. The human had been to places that made Kepler 442b look like a vacation resort. As this realization settled into the creature's consciousness with all the welcome of a terminal diagnosis, additional details began to coalesce into a pattern that grew more disturbing with each new data point. The human's behavioral patterns weren't those of someone lost and desperate. They were the methodical actions of someone conducting a professional assessment of local conditions. Her shelter hadn't been positioned for protection. It had been placed to provide optimal observation and fire control over the surrounding area. Her equipment arrangement wasn't random survival preparation. It was a carefully constructed kill zone designed to channel approaching threats into predetermined engagement areas. Even her apparent casual glances in the creature's direction took on new meaning when viewed through this lens. She wasn't looking for threats. She was conducting target assessment. The Void Stalker found itself confronting a concept that its experience had never prepared it to process: the possibility that it was no longer the hunter in this equation. Worse still was the growing suspicion that this reversal of roles hadn't occurred by accident. The crash site showed signs of controlled impact rather than catastrophic failure. The emergency beacon's signal pattern, when analyzed properly, contained encoded data suggesting the transmission was intended for specific recipients, rather than broadcasting a general distress call. The human's arrival on Kepler 442b was beginning to look less like an accident and more like a deliberate insertion. The creature's mind, evolved for straightforward problems that could be solved through the application of superior firepower, struggled to process the implications. If the human had come here intentionally, knowing full well what awaited in the crystalline wastes, then her presence suggested only one logical conclusion. She considered the Void Stalker to be a manageable threat. This assessment was either staggeringly naive or based on capabilities that the creature had yet to observe in action. As the second sun reached its zenith, casting multiple shadows across the hostile landscape, the human finally moved beyond the immediate vicinity of her shelter. Her exploration pattern was methodical, systematic, and designed to cover maximum territory while maintaining optimal tactical positioning relative to her base of operations. She moved with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to operating in environments where a single mistake could prove fatal. More unnervingly, she moved like someone who expected to be stalked. Her route never offered a clear approach vector for more than a few seconds at a time. She paused regularly at positions that provided comprehensive overwatch of her back trail. When she knelt to examine something of interest, she did so in ways that kept her primary weapon within easy reach, while maintaining situational awareness of potential threat vectors. The Void Stalker had spent decades perfecting its hunting techniques against prey that operated according to predictable patterns of fear and desperation. Faced with a target that seemed to have studied those same techniques from the perspective of active countermeasures, the creature found its tactical options rapidly diminishing. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the human paused beside one of the larger crystalline formations and placed her hand against its surface. For several seconds she remained motionless, and the creature realized she was reading the stone itself, interpreting the claw marks, impact patterns, and stress fractures that recorded the violent history of previous hunts. When she straightened and turned to look directly at the Void Stalker's concealed position, her expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a working hypothesis. She knew exactly what she was dealing with, and, more terrifyingly, she appeared to have a plan for dealing with it. The Void Stalker, apex predator of Kepler-42b and terror of the local stellar group, experienced an emotion that had been absent from its existence for 7 decades. The cold recognition of a problem that might not be solvable through the straightforward application of overwhelming violence. For the first time in its long and successful career, the creature began to consider the previously unthinkable possibility that retreat might be the wisest tactical option available. What was needed was a solution that preserved the creature's reputation while avoiding potentially catastrophic consequences of discovering the human's actual combat capabilities. The Void Stalker's ancient mind, pushed beyond usual parameters, began considering options that would have been unthinkable when problems could be resolved through straightforward violence. Part 4. The Fake Death Gambit. The Void Stalker faced a crisis that 73 years of uncontested dominance had left it spectacularly unprepared to handle: the possibility of retreat from a superior opponent. Unfortunately, the creature's reputation had been built on absolute lethality, witnessed by scattered remains and broadcast across the galaxy through testimony of long-range observers who had watched ships enter the system and never emerge. Backing down from a single human would represent a fundamental contradiction of everything the creature had established about itself. Word would spread, as it inevitably does in a galaxy where information travels faster than common sense, and soon every mercenary and glory-seeking explorer would arrive to test their luck against the Void Stalker that had lost its nerve. Yet direct confrontation with the human carried risks that were becoming more apparent with each passing hour of observation. Her casual competence in hostile environs, combined with equipment designed for encounters significantly more dangerous than anything Kepler-442b had previously offered, suggested that a traditional ambush might result in the sort of educational experience that apex predators rarely survived. What was needed was a solution that preserved the creature's reputation while avoiding the potentially catastrophic consequences of discovering just how capable the human actually was in combat situations. The Void Stalker's ancient mind, pushed beyond its usual parameters by unprecedented circumstances, began to consider options that would have been unthinkable during simpler times, when problems could be resolved through straightforward violence. The plan that eventually emerged was simultaneously brilliant and deeply humiliating. The human had established a pattern of systematic exploration, methodically mapping the immediate area while maintaining tactical awareness of potential threats. Her route would eventually bring her past the largest crystalline formation in the northern sector, a structure that had served as the creature's primary ambush point for decades. The approach offered excellent concealment, multiple escape routes, and clear sightlines across the entire crash site. It was also where the Void Stalker decided to stage its own demise. The creature spent the better part of an hour arranging the scene with the sort of attention to detail that would have impressed a forensic investigator. Its naturally adaptive form allowed for the simulation of massive trauma, complete with the appropriate fluid leakage and tissue damage that would suggest a violent end. The positioning was crucial, close enough to the human's projected path to ensure discovery, but not so obviously placed as to arouse suspicion about the circumstances. Most challenging was the suppression of its own life size to levels that would register as deceased to standard scanning equipment. The Void Stalker's physiology allowed for extended periods of near hibernation, but maintaining the appearance of death while remaining alert enough to monitor the situation required a delicate balance between metabolic shutdown and conscious awareness. The creature settled into its death pose with all the dignity it could muster while sprawled in an undignified heap among the crystalline debris, and waited. The human arrived precisely on schedule, scanning the area before focusing on what appeared to be the system's most feared predator. Her reaction was not triumph or relief, but mild irritation, typically reserved for discovering dirty dishes in the sink. She approached the corpse with weary resignation of someone dealing with another complication in an already complex mission. Her examination was thorough and disturbingly well informed about void stalker anatomy. She tested for vital signs using equipment the creature hadn't realized existed, analyzed tissue samples with portable devices that belonged in advanced laboratories, and conducted scans that penetrated deeper than anything should have been capable of achieving. Throughout this process, the Void Stalker maintained its death simulation, while experiencing the profound discomfort of someone discovering that their supposedly unique characteristics were apparently well documented in scientific literature. The human's muttered commentary revealed a disturbing familiarity with the creature's capabilities, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns. Adaptive camouflage system appears intact, she noted while examining what she believed to be dead tissue. Neural cluster shows expected distribution for ambush predator classification. Musculature consistent with dimensional phase-shifting capability. The creature's growing alarm was compounded by the realization that the human was conducting her examination not with the wonder of someone encountering a legendary beast, but with the clinical detachment of someone confirming known specifications against field observations. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and more disturbingly, she seemed to know exactly what it should be capable of doing. After completing her assessment, the human produced a device that the Void Stalker recognized with horror as a military-grade specimen extraction kit. For several tense minutes, the creature maintained its death simulation while experiencing the unique terror of someone about to be dissected for scientific purposes by an individual who clearly possessed both the equipment and expertise to make the process thoroughly comprehensive. Fortunately for the creature's continued existence, the human's priorities lay elsewhere. After collecting a few tissue samples with the efficiency of someone following a standard protocol, she sealed the specimens in containment units and prepared to continue her survey of the area. Her final action before departing was to place a small device near what she assumed was the creature's primary sensory cluster. The Void Stalker's enhanced perception identified the object as a beacon, designed to broadcast detailed biological data to whoever might be monitoring the human's mission progress. Confirmed elimination of primary territorial threat, she reported to the device with the sort of professional satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a routine task. Proceeding with secondary objectives. Estimated mission completion in 47 hours. As the human departed, continuing her systematic exploration of the crystalline formations, the Void Stalker remained motionless for an additional hour before cautiously returning to full consciousness. The experience had been profoundly educational in ways that the creature's previous existence had never prepared it to appreciate. The most disturbing revelation was not that the human possessed capability to eliminate the system's apex predator, that her casual treatment suggested it was well within operational parameters. Rather, it was the realization that the creature's reputation as insurmountable threat was confined to a much smaller corner of the galaxy than it had imagined. Somewhere in star systems the Void Stalker had never heard of, beings like the human conducted missions that made survival on Kepler 442b look like training exercises. The creature's 7 decades of dominance suddenly seemed less like impressive achievement and more like being the toughest resident of a particularly small pond. As the human's beacon continued transmitting data confirming the creature's demise, the Void Stalker contemplated its situation's irony. It had avoided a confrontation that might have ended badly, preserved territorial control, and gained valuable intelligence about galactic threat assessments. Yet, lying motionless among crystalline debris while pretending to be dead, the creature couldn't shake the feeling it had learnt something profound about apex predators and its own place in that hierarchy. The galaxy, it seemed, was considerably larger and more dangerous than anyone on Kepler 442b had ever bothered to imagine. And somewhere out there, beings who treated legendary death worlds as routine assignments were going about their business with the sort of casual competence that made even fake death seem like a reasonable survival strategy. The Void Stalker decided it was perfectly content to maintain its reputation through the traditional method of killing anything foolish enough to visit its domain. But perhaps, it reflected, it might be more selective about what qualified as foolish in the future.